The one and only debate between former President Donald Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris was last Tuesday, September 10th, for which 67 million viewers tuned in. Today is our 2-hour special in response not only to the debate, but to a ranking of the most important issues to American voters. What are the actual policies of both candidates, and who should you vote for if you haven't made up your mind yet? Let's talk about it. Welcome to episode 49. I'm Blake Watson, and this is We the Free. On Monday this week, Pew Research released their findings on what are the top 10 issues in the 2024 election. On this chart, you'll see the red and the blue on how important each of these issues are to Harris supporters versus Trump supporters. What you won't see are the placements of moderate positions, but you can guesstimate them somewhere in between. And that's the number you see reflected on the right column, an averaging of Harris supporter positions and Trump supporter positions, i.e. the moderates. Notice their dissension. Now, as I've been telling you for the last month or so, moderates and independent voters are the key to victory in the 2024 election. This is backed by data. It's not speculation. That's the reason why both candidates are trying to pander to moderates without losing the support of their base. But it's for this reason that I'm going to analyze the debate between former President Donald Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris, perhaps more different than most other commentators. We're going to address those top 8 issues so that undecided voters can make a truly educated decision in November. However, as you'll recall, I've also outlined repeatedly in 4 simple steps the conservative path to victory. Step 1 is to shore up conservative support because recent polling suggests nearly a quarter of so-called conservatives don't support Donald Trump. Step 2 is to capture undecided voters, which are the moderates and the freer-thinking liberals, because believe it or not, Harris doesn't have the full support of self-identified liberals and moderates, which comprise a third of the electorate. They are narrowly supporting Harris at 55%. Step 3 is to define who they are, Harris and Walz, because again, the research from MRC reveals that most people are ignorant of their record, their history, and their policy, and I mean their real policy positions, not the pretend election ones. Finally, step 4 is to illustrate the contrast historically and politically. In other words, Trump and Vance need to paint the distinction between his first term and her current term, and his future term and her future term. If you do those 4 things, winning is easy. So this is the lens through which the debate will be filtered. Now, back to this list of top issues from Pew Research. We're going to focus on the points of the debate which relate to the top 8 issues for American voters. But first, I have to begin with some opening observations. But before we get to the substance of the debate, I have to address the donkeys in the room. According to Media Research Center, ABC, the host for the debate, is the most biased of the big 3 news networks, giving Kamala Harris positive news coverage 100% of the time, and Donald Trump negative news coverage 93% of the time. One of the moderators, Lindsay Davis, and Kamala Harris were in the same sorority, and Dana Walden, a longtime friend and donor and the person who introduced Kamala Harris to her husband, is the co-chairman of Disney Entertainment, who owns and operates ABC. So yeah, you could say from the very beginning that this was bound and determined to be biased, or as Trump would say, rigged. This is what most of us expected, but I've been wrong before. I was surprised at how fair and fluid the debate was over at CNN with Jake Tapper and Dana Bash. But on this subject, what you'll see is how disparate the treatment was from Harris to Trump. All night long, Kamala Harris was handled with kid gloves while Trump was grilled and debated by the moderators themselves. The moderators fact-checked and interrupted President Trump more than 5 times throughout the 90 minutes, but they never once fact-checked Kamala Harris, who, as you'll see, lied numerous times throughout the night. When President Trump, as a matter of debate strategy, deflected or ignored to answer a question, the moderators pressured him to answer. But Kamala Harris, who dodged and deflected just like he did some of the most crucial questions, was never held to account. Her performance was unusually coherent, which has led many to assume there was a level of collusion between her campaign and the network. Okay, are we ready? Let's get to clip 1. This was an awkward moment. The entrance of the candidates. President Trump and Vice President Harris have never met in person before. Well, Trump went straight to his podium. He wasn't even looking at her. She wanted to meet in the middle of the stage and shake hands first. So watch what happens.
Kamala Harris. Let's have a good debate.
You see, have fun.
Thank you.
Kamala Harris, let's have a good debate. And Trump said, nice to see you, have fun. And they both thanked each other. It was a weird introduction, but that was perhaps the most civil moment of the night. From the moment Kamala Harris stepped onto the stage, she was obviously demonstrating her rehearsed movements and smiles and memorized lines. It reminded me of Ron DeSantis from the primaries. He was trying too hard to look genuine. It looked forced and fake, like he was acting. And I think Kamala made the same mistakes during the debate. And that's, of course, because they wanted to paint a contrast, a literal split-screen image of Trump's serious demeanor and Kamala's fun and chipper, positive, and happy vibes. And that's perfectly in line with what we've been talking about since July. The Harris-Walz campaign is going to avoid answering any questions about their record or policy in an attempt to simply smile and wave their way into the White House. That's why we saw her smiling and laughing for 90 minutes straight on Tuesday night. In total, the moderators asked 23 questions. Vice President Harris was asked 11 of those. President Trump was asked 12 questions. Kamala Harris did not answer more than half of her questions. She didn't answer them. Her other answers were simply to continue current policy. President Trump deflected 2 of his questions, and you'll see why. But again, with Trump's questions, he was refuted and pressed for an answer. The opposite was true with Kamala Harris because ABC is the foremost front of the Praetorian Guard media, shielding the vice president from accountability and negative perception. With that said, let's get to America's biggest concern, the top issue, which is the economy. Kamala Harris was asked, are Americans better off now than they were 4 years ago? She doesn't answer the question, and we'll talk about why in a moment. But let's see what she said.
So I was raised as a middle-class kid, and I am actually the only person on this stage who has a plan that is about lifting up the middle class and working people of America. I believe in the ambition, the aspirations, the dreams of the American people. And that is why I imagine and have actually a plan to build what I call an opportunity economy. Because here's the thing. We know that we have a shortage of homes and housing, and the cost of housing is too expensive for far too many people. We know that young families need support to raise their children, and I intend on extending a tax cut for those families of $6,000, which is the largest child tax credit that we have given in a long time, so that those young families can afford to buy a crib, buy a car seat, buy clothes for their children. My plan is to give a $50,000 tax deduction to startup small businesses, knowing they are part of the backbone of America's economy. My opponent, on the other hand, his plan is to do what he has done before.
Since she didn't answer the question, we will. No, Americans are not better off than they were 4 years ago, 6 years ago. This is where we need to talk about inflation, which is easily understandable. Inflation is the measurement of price changes. When costs go up, you'll see the inflation number higher. When costs go down, you'll see a lower inflation percentage. There's something called the Consumer Price Index, or the Consumer Pricing Index, which simply tracks the price of a standard basket of goods, they call it, which are the goods and services that we use every day or every week as Americans. We're talking about housing, rent, transportation like cars and gasoline, food like groceries and dining, healthcare like medicine, insurance or going to the doctor, clothing, education, communication like your phone bill, recreation like entertainment, music, etc. And there's more categories, but you get the idea. It's the measuring of the price of the things that everyday people want or need every day or every week. So inflation is the rise in prices over time, and CPI is the indicator of how much prices have increased relative to a base year. What is the standard rate of inflation? It's about 2%. And without getting too complicated, the base year is somewhere around 1982. So the inflation rate is saying the average cost of things is blank percent higher than it was in 1982 or 1984. If you go back and look at the numbers for January 2017 to now, September 2024, President Trump's average inflation rate was 1.9%, while President Biden, with VP Harris, have an average inflation rate of 4.9%. In other words, the costs of everyday items are more than double what they were when Trump was in office. Here's what Forbes said about Bidenflation. Inflation has been far worse during the Biden administration, up 19% over the first 42 months of Biden's term, compared to 6% during Trump's first 42 months. According to the government's Consumer Price Index, year over year, inflation peaked under Biden at a 4-decade high of 9% in 2022 before falling to just over 3%, which Biden has blamed on COVID-19's lingering impact and the Russia-Ukraine war. Now, Forbes doesn't present the whole truth here. Does COVID have a lingering impact on the economy? Yes, because many states were too heavy-handed in the shutdowns, causing millions to lose their jobs and their small businesses, and we'll come back to jobs in a moment. Does the Ukrainian conflict have a sizable impact on our economy? Well, compared to other things, no, not so much. But so far, the U.S. has spent $175 billion on that war. So what is the cause of Bidenflation, for which Kamala Harris was wingwoman? Why did inflation reach a 40-year high in 2022? If you listen to the show, you already know the answer. What is the United States' most important product? Petroleum. Why? Because it's connected to everything. Everything. Go back and listen to episode 40. It's called The Emperor Has No Clothes, where we did a deep dive on this. But when Biden and Harris came into office, on their first day, they revoked the permit for the Keystone XL pipeline, which would have transported oil in the most environmentally friendly process, easier from Canada to the United States. They suspended new oil and gas leases on federal lands and waters where crude oil and fossil fuels are extracted from the earth. Their administration delayed permits for other entry infrastructure and pipelines. This all led to draining our strategic petroleum reserves, which Trump had replenished before he left office, potentially compromising emergency energy and national security. They begged foreign countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Venezuela for their oil or more oil. They have constantly repeated the refrain, "no more drilling," and they rejoined the United States to the Paris Climate Accords, which signals to the petroleum industry that more regulations are coming. All of it, was during the very beginning of the Biden-Harris administration. When gas prices were at their worst ever, the highest gas prices ever, it was summer of 2022, which is when Bidenflation peaks at close to 9%. The average price of a gallon of gas was just over $5. That's an all-time record. So it's not just happenstance that under President Trump, your gasoline was around $2 a gallon, and under Biden-Harris's terrible economic and environmental policy, the cost of everything doubled. It's supply and demand and cost of production. When supply is low and demand is high and it costs more to produce, inflation skyrockets. And that, my friends, is why there is a direct connection between Biden's regulations and revocations and the immediate rise in fuel costs, which then dominoes to everything else. That's why inflation was at its highest in recent history when gas was the highest it's ever been. Don't miss the point here, though. The majority of the economic woes under Biden and Harris was their economic policy, their energy policy, and other policies that we'll get to later. Policy is everything. It doesn't matter how friendly and nice and happy someone is if their policies suck. According to Investopedia, the worst unemployment rate ever was in 1933, when 24.9% of Americans were jobless from the Great Depression. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the U.S. Department of Labor, the unemployment rate in 2020 was 6.7%, which was 11 million Americans without work. Listen, COVID hit in the spring of 2020. But take a look at this chart. Unemployment dropped to 3.5% in February of 2020, which was a 50-year low. It had not been that low since December 1969. And then COVID hit. That's the large spike you see in April of 2020 when unemployment surged to 14.8%. Kamala Harris and the Democrats want to soil Trump's impeccable jobs numbers by focusing attention on the pandemic job loss, saying that it's his fault and he gave us the worst economy and job situation. That's what we inherited.
Donald Trump left us the worst unemployment since the Great Depression.
There's a few problems here. First of all, there is only a kernel of truth in her claim, but it's mostly misleading. The significant job loss from the pandemic, as I've already alluded, is falsely attributed to Donald Trump because just as he's done with the issue of abortion, he left decisions to the states. And in many states, they allowed their counties to make their own decisions about safety measures and protocols and how long they would have shutdowns, etc. He didn't want to be a dictator that everyone on the far left makes him out to be, so he let governors decide and mayors decide how to run their states and their counties. The significant job loss is due to the extensive lockdown measures and shutdowns, which costs millions of people their jobs and their businesses. Just ask Minnesotans how they feel about Tim Walz's leadership in 2020. Secondly, prior to COVID, Trump's economy was very, very good, and unemployment was at a 50-year low. COVID hit and the lockdowns happened. That's when unemployment spiked to 14.8%. However, by the time Trump left office and Biden and Harris took the reins, unemployment dropped to 6.4%. Now, if we take a look at that chart again, you can see that unemployment since about September of 2022 has been rising for 2 years. The current unemployment rate is 4.2%, which is over 7 million Americans without work. Forbes reports, much of the Biden labor market gains are part of the post-pandemic recovery, as unemployment was just 3.5% in February 2020, and the number of employed Americans is up only 4%. Biden has largely focused on the COVID-skewed data points, and Trump's labor market performance depends strictly on the cutoff date, as the COVID-19 disruption undid much of the nominal progress, sending unemployment briefly to an all-time high of 14.9% in April 2020. Trump's way of putting this is that Biden and Harris have enjoyed reporting what he calls bounce-back jobs, or jobs that are a natural occurrence in the aftermath of a global pandemic. And he's right. Earlier this year, I reported to you that most of the Biden-Harris job growth is from Americans leaving states like New York and California, moving to a different state like Texas or Florida and getting a job there. So literally, any job counts to them as job growth. Well, it turns out they've been misleading the public on their job reporting. CNN reported in August, the Bureau of Labor Statistics preliminary annual benchmark review of employment data suggests that there were 818,000 fewer jobs in March of this year than were initially reported. The beautiful thing about this election is that we know both of the candidates very well. There's no secret to either of them. Yes, Donald Trump is relatively new to politics, but the man was president for 4 years. He lost his re-election in 2020, and here he is once again as the Republican nominee. Kamala Harris has been in politics for 2 decades. She became a district attorney in 2004, an attorney general in 2011, a senator in 2017, and the vice president in 2021. We know exactly who she is, and I've talked about both of their records extensively on this show. But Kamala Harris thinks that you'll forget that fact. She thinks that you won't remember that Trump has already been the president. So when Trump is asked about his economic policy and he signals a return to Trumpian policy, Kamala Harris gaslights the voter and says stuff like this.
Donald Trump has no plan for you. And when you look at his economic plan, it's all about tax breaks for the richest people. I am offering what I describe as an opportunity economy, and the best economists in our country, if not the world, have reviewed our relative plans for the future of America. What Goldman Sachs has said is that Donald Trump's plan would make the economy worse, mine would strengthen the economy.
Donald Trump has no plan for you, she says, just minutes after saying that Donald Trump has a plan for you, and it's called Project 2025, which for the 1,000th time, he has literally nothing to do with. He's disavowed it. I've actually read it, and trust me, his positions do not align with the conservative think tank's positions. She says Donald Trump has no plan for you, and then says Donald Trump's economic plans are tax cuts for the richest people. Now, just remember, we have all the records from Trump's first term, and we have all the records from the Biden-Harris term. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 cuts the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%. That helped American businesses compete internationally and gave them more money to pay their employees, which are mostly middle-class Americans, and to invest more in their products. American companies would also only be taxed on their domestic income instead of their worldwide earnings. Over 6 million American workers, received wage increases and bonuses and increased benefits as well. Individually, each tax bracket was lowered at varying rates. The child tax credit was doubled, and the average family of 4 earning $75,000 a year received an income tax cut of more than $2,000, which cut their tax bill in half. That's what Donald Trump did. That's why you have retained those tax codes. That's right. If they were so bad, you would have gotten rid of them And that's what he will do again if reelected. She can argue and say, well, the experts say that my plan is better, but we have the unique opportunity to look at the last 8 years and compare the numbers. The Biden-Harris economy has been significantly worse than the Trump economy, and that's a fact. However, Kamala has, once again, presented a kernel of truth. The Goldman Sachs CEO, David Solomon, has downplayed Kamala's remarks there because the difference between Trump's plans and Kamala's so-called plans is quite minuscule. He said the difference was 0.2%, and that's because of one thing, one humongous thing, the federal deficit, or what we can call spending. Trump's economic numbers would have been even better had he not spent so much money during the pandemic. But he was spending money on a medical emergency and in stimulating the economy and R&D for vaccines and therapeutics. The Biden-Harris administration has done the same thing, just not on a pandemic. They have spent lots of money on bloated bills with oxymoronic names like the Inflation Reduction Act, which added nearly $1 trillion to the debt. It didn't reduce anything. And Kamala's plan includes lots more government spending, like a whole lot more. The only policies she's actually mentioned have to do with handouts or the government spending more money, our money, just giving out money. They also want to raise taxes across the board. And when the government spends too much money and overtaxes, the economy inevitably suffers. Now, Trump did several things to offset the federal government's loss in revenue to tax cuts, but one of those things was the implementation of strong tariffs, which is a tax on foreign imports. Again, Donald Trump did this when he was president. We were all there. We all saw it, and we saw the economic success. But again, the Democrats think we're stupid and forgetful, so they push this narrative.
Do you believe Americans can afford higher prices because of tariffs?
They're not going to have higher prices. What's going to have and who's going to have higher prices is China and all of the countries that have been ripping us off for years. I was the only president ever. China was paying us hundreds of billions of dollars, and so were other countries. And, you know, if she doesn't like them, they should have gone out and they should have immediately cut the tariffs. But those tariffs are there 3.5 years now under their administration.
Two important points here. First, tariffs are used to create economic leverage with a competing nation in the business of trade. We've been in a trade war with China for years. Trump is right when he says that China has been ripping us off for years. The United States has been importing Chinese products far more than China has imported American products. In 2018, the trade deficit with China was over $419 billion, as in America spent over $419 billion more dollars than what China spent on American products. So what did President Trump do? He imposed tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods, all in an effort to protect American jobs and industries and workers. Why does this work? China has to pay more to import their products into the United States. That means that Chinese companies will either have to raise their prices or stop selling to the US, which they won't do because the United States is a pivotal market. They need us. So they're forced to take their cheap crap and make it more expensive. Well, what happens here? Americans go, well, we can do better than this. And Americans start buying American-made products instead of Chinese products. Does that make sense? And Trump's hopes are that China caves to the pressure and buys more American products, which would be wonderful for Americans and the United States. This is also why Trump pointed out that Biden and Harris kept a number of these Trump tariffs intact. The moderators asked her about this, and She didn't answer. Speaking of exporting, the main reason that Donald Trump's economy was so much better than Biden and Harris's economy is because Trump's administration unleashed the petroleum industry to the point of the United States becoming a net oil exporter for the first time in 75 years. At one point during his term, the United States became the #1 producer of oil and natural gas in the world. A large part of the energy boom was due to the untethering of hydraulic fracturing, which goes by a different name, fracking. Fracking is a revolutionary process of much more easily extracting natural gas and oil from the earth, which could not have been obtained through traditional means. It's the use of hydraulic pressure to push the materials from the earth beneath us. But the controversy relates to its environmental impact. For one, it makes it easier to obtain oil and natural gas, the things that contribute to the purported destruction of the planet, and it must be stopped. But critics say it contaminates water and causes earthquakes and allows for greenhouse emissions. This is why Kamala Harris said this when she was running for president in 2019.
My family lives in western Pennsylvania, where fracked gas wells have become a common sight, yet the toxic impacts of fracking on the community are immense, from contaminated groundwater to poisonous emissions. Will you commit to implementing a federal ban on fracking your first day in office, adding the United States to the list of countries who have banned this devastating practice?
There's no question I'm in favor of banning fracking. So, yes, and starting with what we can do on day one around public lands, right? And then there has to be legislation. But yes, and this is something I've taken on in California. I have a history of working on this issue. And to your point, we have to just acknowledge that the residual impact of fracking is enormous in terms of the impact on the health and safety of communities. Yeah, so thank you.
So would you ban offshore drilling?
Yes, and I've, again, worked on that.
There's no question I'm in favor of banning fracking. So you remember that gas prices reached an all-time record high in the summer of 2022, and inflation reached almost 9% at that same time. Well, in August of 2022, Congress passed the Inflation Reduction Act by the tie-breaking vote of Vice President Harris. The legislation supports the expansion of oil and gas leases on federal lands, which would include fracking. But at the same time, the act aims to regulate and reduce the environmental impact of fossil fuel production, which includes stricter methane regulations, as in companies can face federal penalties. So it's odd that they incorporated such provisions into the act right after record gas prices, the highest inflation in decades, and after such a strong stance against anything having to do with petroleum in the United States. There was a flip in policy. In fact, there are a number of policies which Kamala Harris has supposedly flipped on: gun rights, the border, electric vehicle mandates, plastics, policing, universal health care, etc. She was asked about this by Lindsay Davis. The question is, why have so many of your policy positions changed? This is what she says.
My values have not changed, and I'm going to discuss every one of at least every point that you've made. But in particular, let's talk about fracking because we're here in Pennsylvania. I made that very clear in 2020. I will not ban fracking. I have not banned fracking as Vice President of the United States, and in fact, I was the tie-breaking vote on the Inflation Reduction Act, which opened new leases for fracking.
Values are not the same as policies. She dodged the question, and the moderators didn't press her for an answer. She only mentions fracking. She lies at first to make it seem like she didn't oppose fracking in the last election. I just played you the clip. She most definitely did, and Trump's face says it all. To finish off with economic policy, here's Howard Lutnick on CNBC.
There's only one way to break inflation, okay? And that is to bring down energy costs. The only tool that you really have to break inflation is to bring down, you have to stop printing money. God knows you have to stop printing money because we all know where inflation comes from, right? Inflation comes from the American Rescue Plan, which was passed in 2021, which created $2 trillion of new cash being produced, right? That came into the economy. Everyone said it's going to create inflation. It created inflation in the middle of 2022. Okay, so we all know where inflation came from. It's called the American Rescue Plan. $2 trillion of spending. Look, you can't produce inflation without printing money. If you don't print money, you can't produce inflation.
Now onto the subject of healthcare. The conversation about healthcare revolved around Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act. Trump's goal is to replace Obamacare completely, but he didn't lay out anything specific. We'll come back to that in a moment. The moderators didn't ask Kamala Harris anything about her statements on providing health care for illegal immigrants, but her response was to say that health care was a right and to brag about lowering prescription drug costs, but she didn't lay out a specific plan either, other than perpetuating Obamacare. In response to this, I want you to hear this testimony from David Garza on TikTok to understand the problems with Obamacare and the Democratic position on healthcare. Watch.
I'm a two-time bone cancer survivor. I voted for Obama Biden in 2008 based on Obamacare. And then when Obamacare was implemented, I promptly lost my insurance. I could not keep my plan. I could not keep my doctor. That put me in a tailspin of losing insurance. And then on top of that, I got penalized for not having insurance that I could no longer afford. Now that was pre-Donald Trump political career. That had nothing to do with Donald Trump. That had to do with the Democratic Party leaving me behind, even though I voted for them. Now come along to 2016. Donald Trump campaigns on getting rid of the penalty for no insurance. And he did that. Helped my family out and me specifically.
While Obamacare reduced the number of uninsured Americans, it raised premiums, raised deductibles, created penalties, caused provider network issues, hurt small businesses, raised taxes, and there were two more problems which you heard Mr. Garza allude to there. The massive difference is that Donald Trump wants to remove the burdens of Obamacare and steer away from a massively socialized healthcare network, whereas Kamala Harris wants to avoid specifics and further socialize healthcare, not to mention offering it to non-citizens, which most Americans are opposed to. Why? Money. That's why. It would hurt all Americans financially to do so. And one more thing on the subject of health. Another falsehood that Kamala keeps spreading, along with the media and the Democratic Party, which are one and the same thing, is that the pandemic was Trump's fault. The exact quote from the debate was, "Donald Trump left us with the worst public health epidemic in a century." First of all, COVID-19 spread throughout the entire world because of a proven Chinese virology lab leak, in which they were conducting gain-of-function research, where they intentionally strengthen viruses for research and development. We have documented evidence of this fact, but that's who is to blame for COVID-19. Listen to me. The world should now know that you cannot prevent the spread of that sort of virus. It will eventually get to you. It will. Regardless of masks and vaccines and distancing and lockdowns, quarantining, the latter only delays the inevitable. But the left pretends as if Donald Trump was supposed to encapsulate the United States in a protective bubble and blast us into outer space. Now, I wish that President Trump had responded with another devastating fact that more Americans have died from coronavirus in Biden and Harris's first year than in Trump's final year. By December of 2021, more than 400,000 Americans died from COVID-19 on Biden and Harris's watch, to use the language of the left. The third most important issue to Americans this election has to do with Supreme Court appointments. Now, there wasn't a single question about this, and you'll see why in a moment. There were a handful of references and mentions of the Supreme Court and their rulings in response to other questions, but there was never a question about the Supreme Court. Why is that? Well, for two reasons. The first reason is that the Supreme Court has been a deterrent to the Biden-Harris administration, and thank God for that. They struck down the student loan forgiveness program. They restrained the tyranny of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. 2 years ago, they ruled that the Biden-Harris administration must enforce Trump's Remain in Mexico policy. They blocked the Department of Labor's vaccine mandate. They've protected Second Amendment rights. They got rid of Chevron deference, which will limit the power of federal agencies. And oh yeah, they overturned Roe v. Wade. And there's more, but you get the point. The Biden-Harris administration has been stifled by one of our co-equal branches of government. It's called checks and balances. Second, in addition to those legal deterrents, their rulings have discredited the insurrection charge against Trump in more than one case, one regarding immunity and the other on electoral disqualification. They have reserved his position on the presidential ballot. They have protected states like Arizona in tightening up their election processes so as to ensure election integrity. And they've declined to intervene in legal disputes regarding Trump's taxes and business records, and I'm certain they'll be involved in the eventual appeal of this case in New York, the campaign finance case. Now, you put all of that together, and you've got a major political party who is really unhappy with the legal sandwich they've been served. On one side, you've got these men and women in black robes standing in their way, and on the other side, you've got the same group tearing down their efforts to destroy Donald Trump. So, what do you do if you don't want to eat that sandwich? Well, it's three things rolled into one. They call it Supreme Court reform, but by that they mean instituting term limits, ethics codes and regulations, and the big juicy one is packing the court or adding justices or expanding the court. Kamala's campaign website reads the following because she finally added some policy positions. Vice President Harris believes that no one is above the law. She'll fight to ensure that no former president has immunity for crimes committed while in the White House. She will also support common sense Supreme Court reforms, like requiring justices to comply with ethics rules that other federal judges are bound by and imposing term limits to address the crisis of confidence facing the Supreme Court. Their outspoken plan was reported by Reuters this summer before Biden was dumped. They said, Biden called on Congress to pass binding and enforceable rules that would require the justices to disclose gifts, refrain from public political activity, and recuse themselves from cases in which they or their spouses have financial or other conflicts of interest. He also urged the adoption of an 18-year term limit for the justices who currently serve life tenures. Biden and Harris have, since 2020, avoided answering the question of, do you support expanding the court? In their first campaign together, they basically said, we'll answer the question after the election. Before joining forces, Kamala is the one recorded saying she's open to the idea. Elizabeth Warren views expansion of the court as necessary to restore balance to the court. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez says the same thing to restore fairness. Ed Markey, another Democrat senator, actually introduced legislation to expand the justice count from 9 to 13 because we must protect democracy. The Constitution does not specify a number of justices for the Supreme Court, which the framers and founders did create. They left that up to Congress. In 1789, they established 6 justices. However, the court has had 9 justices since 1869. In order to change everything, Congress has to pass a bill and the president has to approve it. If the president vetoes the bill and it returns to Congress, they can pass a bill without him with a 2/3 majority vote. So that means something like 67 senators out of 100 and 290 representatives out of 435 could pass the bill. In other words, it's very unlikely to happen. That's why the Supreme Court has had its current makeup for 155 years. Moving on to foreign policy, the fourth most important issue to Americans. This is how we relate and respond to other nations. It's diplomacy, it's national security, protecting the U.S. from external threats. It also involves economic policy, as you heard earlier, but this is really important because, as we've seen in our short history, when America is strong and has good foreign policy, it's not only the United States which is safer and more prosperous, the world is safer and better for it. But how did we get to today? In 2014, President Obama was in his second term. There were wide protests in Ukraine against Viktor Yanukovych, who had rejected association with the European Union to maintain closer ties with Russia. In other words, he was a pro-Russian president. These protests persisted for months to the point that Yanukovych fled the country. The United States supported the protests. Our politicians like John McCain visited to encourage them. Ultimately, a new government was established, a pro-Western government, which the U.S. was involved in establishing, even assisting in the selection of its new leadership. Vladimir Putin viewed this effort as a coup d'etat, and Russia responded by annexing the Ukrainian territory of Crimea. Prior to 2015, Iran faced sanctions from the United States, the United Nations, and the European Union. Why? Because they were building nuclear weapons, funding and supporting terrorism like Hezbollah, Hamas, and Shia militias in Iraq. Huge human rights violations against political dissidents and women, their ballistic missile program, etc. The sanctions cut Iran off from global markets and trade, exporting oil, etc. And the point is always, stop what you're doing, change your ways, or we will continue to put economic pressure on you. Well, then President Obama came along with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action and the Iran nuclear deal in 2015. This lifted the sanctions on Iran in exchange for limiting production and frequently inspecting their uranium enrichment facilities. A part of this deal included unfreezing nearly $100 billion in assets. And outside the Iran nuclear deal, in the following year, we gave Iran $1.7 billion in some ridiculous settlement from a military equipment deal going back to 1979. Well, this is right before President Trump takes office, during which time, in 2018, we withdrew from the deal. Why? Because of common sense. The restrictions as a part of the deal were not intended to permanently stop their nuclear program, and they were set to expire after a decade. The deal did nothing to address their missile production, which would be the rockets to carry the nuclear warheads. The inspections were not extensive. They were not unannounced, so they could very well have easily hidden any activity. And oh yeah, they're the state sponsor of terror in the Middle East. Not to mention, dictators and supreme leaders don't exactly use wealth to enrich the lives of their citizens. So Trump reimposed crippling sanctions on Iran. Trump also took out Qasem Soleimani 2 years later. And again, Iran could have stopped with all of their senseless, terroristic garbage in order to improve the lives of Iranians. But they chose not to. They just held out for 2020 when Joseph Robinette Biden shuffled into the White House and they began negotiations on reinstating the JCPOA. On the eastern border of Iran sits another country known as Afghanistan, where the U.S. has had heavy military presence for 2 decades due to the war on terror in the aftermath of 9/11. Their goals were to eliminate al-Qaeda, remove the Taliban, that's 2 terrorist regimes, the former harboring the latter, and establish democracy there. Well, that last goal proved to be impossible. And that's what most of the American leadership understood, including our last 3 presidents. However, the process of ending the war and withdrawing our involvement also proved very difficult. President Obama brought large swaths of our forces home, but President Trump had a plan. His administration created a peace deal with the Taliban in February of 2020, which included a timeline for removal. In 135 days, U.S. forces would be out by May 1st, 2021. If the Taliban agreed not to allow groups like al-Qaeda to operate, and they had to agree to a ceasefire, not harming a single American in that timeline, in the process. There was a transition process negotiated, and if the Taliban broke their agreement, the process would stop. Well, Trump didn't win a re-election, and when the Taliban began to break their ends of the deal, Biden did nothing. He pressed forward and set a deadline for removal by August 30th, 2021. Then, months later, the removal began. The Taliban quickly took control of Kabul, and thousands of Afghans and foreign nationals, like Americans, began fleeing the country. The newly established Afghan government collapsed, and a frantic evacuation began. The Hamid Karzai International Airport in Kabul became the epicenter of chaos as thousands were attempting to flee the country. The Afghan military crumbled without full U.S. support there. And then, on August 26th, a suicide bomber killed 60 Afghans and 13 U.S. soldiers. 120,000 people were evacuated, but many were left behind, including American citizens and allies, leaving them vulnerable to Taliban assault. The U.S. also left behind over $80 billion in military equipment, which immediately fell into the hands of the Taliban, a terrorist organization. We're talking guns, rockets, vehicles, and aircrafts left in the hands of terrorists. Not only did this frustrate our NATO allies, it was a signal to our enemies that the new American regime was weak, stupid, and messy. That is why 6 months later, on February 24th, 2022, Vladimir Putin declared a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It's the same reason that China has increased military pressure, diplomatic isolation, and economic pressure on Taiwan. And it's the same reason that an Iranian-sponsored terror regime known as Hamas murdered over 1,200 Israeli citizens on October 7th, 2023. This is what bad foreign policy creates. Global destabilization, chaos, and death. Right now, Americans have a choice to continue with more of the same or return to a time of peaceful and strong foreign policy in a second Trump administration.
He's trying to, again, divide and distract from the reality, which is it is very well known that Donald Trump is weak and wrong on national security and foreign policy. And it is absolutely well known that these dictators and autocrats are rooting for you to be president again because they're so clear they can manipulate you with flattery and favors. And that is why So many military leaders who you have worked with have told me you are a disgrace. That is why we understand that we have to have a president who is not consistently weak and wrong on
Vice
national
President
security,
Harris.
including the importance of upholding and respecting in highest regard our military.
Putin endorsed her last week, said, I hope she wins. And I think he meant it, because what he's gotten away with is absolutely incredible. It wouldn't have happened with me. The leaders of other countries think that they're weak and incompetent, and they are. They're grossly incompetent. And I just ask one question. Why does Biden go in and kill the Keystone Pipeline and approve the single biggest deal that Russia's ever made, Nord Stream 2, the biggest pipeline anywhere in the world going to Germany and all over Europe? Because they're weak and they're ineffective. And Biden, by the way,
President
gets paid
Trump,
a lot of money.
Thank you. We have a lot of issues to get to.
As the moderators cut him off. If we take the origins of the conflicts in order, the candidates were asked how they would end the war in Ukraine and how they would deal with Vladimir Putin. Keep in mind all of this history and listen to what they both said.
We're in for $250 billion or more because they don't ask Europe, which is a much bigger beneficiary to getting this thing done than we are. They're in for $150 billion less because Biden and you don't have the courage to ask Europe like I did with NATO. You take a look at what's happening. We're in for 250 to 275 billion. They're into 100 to 150. They should be forced to equalize. With that being said, I want to get the war settled. I know Zelensky very well, and I know Putin very well. I have a good relationship, and they respect your president, okay? They respect me. They don't respect Biden. How would you respect him? Why? For what reason? He hasn't even made a phone call in 2 years to Putin, hasn't spoken to anybody. They don't even try and get it. That is a war that's dying to be settled. I will get it settled before I even become president. If I win, when I'm president-elect, and what I'll do is I'll speak to one, I'll speak to the other, I'll get them together. That war would have never happened. And now you have millions of people dead, and it's only getting worse, and it could lead to World War III. Don't kid yourself, David. We're playing with World War III, and we have a president that we don't even know if he's... Where is our president?
I believe the reason that Donald Trump says that this war would be over within 24 hours is because he would just give it up. And that's not who we are as Americans. Let's understand what happened here. I actually met with Zelensky a few days before Russia invaded, tried through force to change territorial boundaries, to defy one of the most important international rules and norms, which is the importance of sovereignty and territorial integrity. And I met with President Zelensky. I shared with him American intelligence about how he could defend himself. Days later, I went to NATO's eastern flank, to Poland and Romania. And through the work that I and others did, we brought 50 countries together to support Ukraine in its righteous defense. And because of our support, because of the air defense, the ammunition, the artillery, the javelins, the Abrams tanks that we have provided, Ukraine stands as an independent and free country. If Donald Trump were president, Putin would be sitting in Kyiv right now. Putin would be sitting in Kyiv with his eyes on the rest of Europe, starting with Poland. And why don't you tell the 800,000 Polish Americans right here in Pennsylvania how quickly you would give up for the sake of favor and what you think is a friendship with what is known to be a dictator who would eat you for lunch.
And how's that approach working out for you, Madam Vice President? The war has gotten nowhere. It has cost thousands and thousands of lives and lots of money. Now, with the impending permission and provision of the West, Ukraine may receive powerful long-range missiles to strike accurately deep into Russia, an act that Putin, Volodin, and Peskov interpret as the West at war with Russia. That's why Trump is correct to warn of a third world war. You're literally seeing the formation of the two sides, somewhat like the Allies and the Axis powers. Donald Trump will take immediate steps to end the conflict. Kamala Harris would further antagonize the Russians. Then she was asked if she bore any responsibility for the botched withdrawal from Afghanistan. Here's what she said.
Do you believe you bear any responsibility in the way that withdrawal played out?
Well, I will tell you, I agreed with President Biden's decision to pull out of Afghanistan. 4 presidents said they would, and Joe Biden did. And as a result, America's taxpayers are not paying the $300 million a day we were paying for that endless war. And as of today, there is not one member of the United States military who is in active duty in a combat zone in any war zone around the world, the first time this century.
She didn't answer the question. She went on for another 2 minutes attacking President Trump. But again, the moderators didn't hold her feet to the fire, which she so rightly deserves. She also lied about active troops. We have thousands of troops in combat zones, and many have died in 2024 alone. But of course, she wasn't fact-checked on that either. Here she was in 2021 bragging about being the last person in the room to decide on the withdrawal.
You just made a really big decision. Afghanistan.
Yes.
Were you the last person in the room?
Yes.
And you feel comfortable?
I do. And I'm going to add to that. This is a president who has an extraordinary amount of courage.
She's comfortable, and Biden is courageous. When asked how to solve the conflict with Israel and Hamas and Iran by extension, here's what Kamala Harris said.
What we know is that this war must end. It must end immediately, and the way it will end is we need a ceasefire deal and we need the hostages out. And so we will continue to work around the clock on that. Work around the clock, also understanding that we must chart a course for a 2-state solution. And in that solution, there must be security for the Israeli people and Israel, and in equal measure for the Palestinians. But the one thing I will assure you always, I will always give Israel the ability to defend itself, in particular as it relates to Iran, and any threat that Iran and its proxies pose to Israel. But we must have a 2-state solution where we can rebuild Gaza, where the Palestinians have security, self-determination, and the dignity they so rightly deserve.
Okay, 2 things here, and this is really simple. It really is. Hamas will never agree to a ceasefire because they're terrorists and they want Israel to disappear. Israel will never agree to a ceasefire as long as Hamas exists and hostages are retained. Secondly, there is no such thing, and there will never be such a thing as a 2-state solution. It's been tried over and over, and the terrorists and the rabid anti-Semites don't want it. They want a single-state solution, an Arab state. And why? Because they're terrorists, and they want Israel to disappear. You don't have to dig too far into Middle Eastern history to know this. But follow the money here. President Trump choked Iran off from economic welfare, the state sponsor of terror. Biden and Harris came along and reopened the spigot. So the money flowed in and flowed all the way to Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis through training, weapons, and support, and here we are. It is their fault that October 7th happened in numerous ways. But in a nutshell, it's from bad foreign policy. Here was President Trump's response.
It would have never happened. Iran was broke under Donald Trump. Now Iran has $300 billion because they took off all the sanctions that I had. Iran had no money for Hamas or Hezbollah or any of the 28 different spheres of terror, and they are spheres of terror, horrible terror. They had no money. She hates Israel. She wouldn't even meet with Netanyahu when he went to Congress to make a very important speech. She refused to be there because she was at a sorority party of hers. She wanted to go to the sorority party.
And that story is absolutely true. Biden met with him, but after freshly becoming the nominee for the Democratic Party, Kamala Harris skipped the meeting for a sorority party because, again, she has great foreign policy. I also want to point out that instead of asking her to either confirm or deny Trump's claims, the moderator said, "Donald Trump says you hate Israel. Is that true?" Let's just move on. The next most important issue at number 5 is violent crime. At one point in the debate, when President Trump was responding to a question about immigration, he said the following. Now, pay close attention to how he's corrected by David Muir.
Crime is down all over the world except here. Crime here is up and through the roof. Despite their fraudulent statements that they made, crime in this country is through the roof. And we have a new form of crime. It's called migrant crime. And it's happening at levels that nobody thought possible.
President Trump, as you know, the FBI says overall violent crime is actually coming down in this country. But Vice
Excuse me,
President
the
Harris,
FBI they were defrauding statements. They didn't include the worst cities. They didn't include the cities with the worst crime. It was a fraud.
David Muir was referring to the quarterly FBI report that shows that violent crime is down 15.2%. from where it was last year. But that's far from the bigger picture here. First of all, we know from the report that only 72% of our nation's law enforcement agencies participated in that report. However, the DOJ's Bureau of Justice Statistics does its own reporting that includes crimes that aren't reported to the police. Take a look at the real data here, and I'll read to you from their report. The annual National Crime Victimization Survey, NCVS, showed total instances of reported violent crime, including rape, robbery, and aggravated assault, is up from 5.6 per 1,000 in 2020 to 8.7 per 1,000 in 2023. The highest recent rate of violent crime was in 2022, when the survey tracked 9.8 instances per 1,000 people over the age of 12. The rate of rape increased from 1.2 per 1,000 in 2020 to 1.7 in 2023, while robbery went from 1.6 per 1,000 in 2020 to 2.6 per 1,000 in 2023. Aggravated assault rose from 2.9 per 1,000 in 2020 to 4.5 per 1,000 in 2023. The NCVS also showed other forms of crime were up from 2019, including stranger violence, 8.1 per 1,000 compared to 11.4 per 1,000 in 2023, and violent crime with a weapon, 4 per 1,000 versus 5.3 per 1,000 in 2023. Motor car theft has also increased from 3.9 per 1,000 in 2019 to 6.1 per 1,000 in 2023. In other words, Trump was correct. Violent crime is through the roof. It went down when he was in office. It has gone way, way up since Biden and Harris have been in office. And David Muir should issue an apology for this quote-unquote fact check. Now, the most viral moment of the night was related to this issue of crime in the United States. President Trump commented on Kamala Harris's reversal in policy positions, including on defunding the police.
She was big on defund the police. In Minnesota, she went out. Wait a minute, I'm talking now. If you don't mind, please. Does that sound familiar?
Trump was referencing the vice presidential debates of 2020 when Harris continually said that line to Vice President Pence.
He will not raise taxes on anybody who makes less than $400,000 a year.
He said he's going to repeal the Trump tax cuts.
Mr. Vice President, I'm speaking.
Well,
I'm speaking.
It'd be important if you said the truth.
That is absolutely not true.
Is he only going to repeal part of the Trump tax cuts?
If you don't mind letting me finish, we can then have a conversation, okay?
Please.
Okay.
Well, that springboards us into the 6th ranked issue of importance, and it's the second most important issue to Trump supporters and the least important issue to Harris supporters, and that is the issue of immigration. Now, I've talked about this issue ad nauseum for a year. I've spoken extensively about this subject. It is a complicated issue, but it's easily understandable, in my opinion. My guess is, if you consider yourself moderate on the issue, you want to help these migrants who seem to be coming to the United States for a better life. But you agree with conservative Americans who think they should come through the proper channels instead of illegally entering the U.S. through our porous southern border. If you're liberal or a leftist, then you view America as a big tent. You echo the lines of the new Colossus. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. Well, first, let's take a look at this data from Pew Research, which shows the monthly migrant encounters by U.S. Border Patrol at the U.S.-Mexico border from the year 2000 to December 2023. When you look at the right third of the chart, President Trump had record low border encounters two times in his administration. It hit a record low during the pandemic. Then in January 2021, there was truly an explosion in migrant encounters. And you have to understand what this is demonstrating. This isn't talking about asylum seekers and people trying to immigrate legally. This chart is demonstrating border apprehensions and expulsions. In December of 2023, these illegal, also known as criminal, encounters reached a record high of almost 250,000 just in the month of December. It was 250,000 in December. So since January of 2021, there have been millions of these interactions. Homeland Security reports that we're on track to have 10 million encounters under the Biden administration by the end of 2024. But the Biden administration also created a mass parole program called CHNV, the initials there meaning Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, which serves to preemptively admit hundreds of thousands of migrants, admit them into the United States for up to 2 years. What happens after that? Well, they can apply for asylum or visas or go back to their home country. So Customs and Border Patrol created an app called CBP One, and migrants can use the app to schedule an appointment for an interview at a U.S. port of entry. They can also use the app to submit their information and their documents to be considered for parole, so they can't just show up at the border. Now, guess how many appointments have been scheduled through the CBP app? Just guess a number. 591,000. Just since January of 2023. 591,000. Now look at this. This is from the House Committee on Homeland Security. Nearly 96% of those have been released into the United States. You also see reported there that over 27,000 Chinese nationals were encountered, meaning they were apprehended and sent away. 27,000, trying to come in between ports of entry. They also report, as a part of the CHNV parole program, that 434,000 plus Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans have been mass paroled since the program began under Biden and Harris. Those are people that we know are here. But you have to wonder how effective the vetting process is, given the news that's emerging from all over the country in the past few years. Additionally, the committee reports nearly 2 million gotaways, which are people who are detected by CBP, but they evade apprehension and successfully enter the country. 2 million. In this year alone, CBP has arrested more than 21,000 people with criminal convictions or outstanding warrants. Remember that, because we'll come back to that in a moment. More than 21,000 convicted criminals. Since Biden and Harris have been in office, CBP has apprehended 362 people on the terror watch list at the southern border. As in, these are people in a database of terrorists, and here they are trying to come into the United States. I'm sure for our theme parks and the Grand Canyon. Now let's hit the pause button for a second. America is a nation of immigrants. We are literally a collection of people with global ancestral origins and roots who came together on the same mass of land for the ideas espoused in our founding: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's why so many people want to come to the United States of America. That's why I'm here. That's why you're here. Immigration is not wrong or inherently evil. Mass migration can be. Mass illegal migration absolutely is wrong. And let me tell you why. If you pay attention, you'll notice this is what's happening all around the world, in different parts of the world. So, an influx of undocumented migrants, as we've had in the US for 3.5 years, creates a massive, massive strain on public services like healthcare, education, and social services. Why? Because when suddenly a whole lot of people are using public services that aren't paying taxes, it's a fast, destructive strain on local, state, and federal budgets. They cannot, by law, be denied emergency services, regardless of paying for them or not, which then costs healthcare providers and, just by volume, overcrowds the system. Emergency rooms and hospitals become overcrowded. Public schools struggle to keep up in accommodating non-English speaking students. And any teacher will tell you that larger classes are harder to work with, meaning more kids get less of an education because the teacher doesn't have time. You also have millions of people who are suddenly looking for work, but they can't speak the language, and it's next to impossible for them to get a job legally because they're here illegally. They do, however, integrate into manual labor jobs, which drives down wages and displaces American workers. This is what Donald Trump meant when he said they're taking black jobs. And in the debate, he clarified blacks and Hispanics.
On top of that, we have millions of people pouring into our country from prisons and jails, from mental institutions and insane asylums, and they're coming in and they're taking jobs that are occupied right now by African Americans and Hispanics, and also unions. Unions are going to be affected very soon. And you see what's happening. You see what's happening with towns throughout the United States. You look at Springfield, Ohio. You look at Aurora in Colorado. They are taking over the towns. They're taking over buildings. They're going in violently. These are the people that Xi and Biden led into our country, and they're destroying our country. They're dangerous. They're at the highest level of criminality, and we have to get them out. We have to get them out fast.
He's saying that millions that are here illegally are taking jobs away from the millions that are here legally because employers can pay them significantly lower wages, leaving Americans with nothing. What's more, they have to find somewhere to live. So there's suddenly a massive demand for low-income, affordable housing. Again, that then drives up the cost of rent and leaves Americans looking for a place to live. We're talking about the millions that are in the U.S. unlawfully, unauthorized, undocumented, and unknown. Now, the other part of that clip is Trump's allusion to what he calls migrant crime and the alleged origin of said crime, that certain countries are emptying their prisons and insane asylums in order to export them to the United States. To most people, especially liberals and possibly a majority of moderates, this story seems outlandish, like a scare tactic, but let's consider some of the things that have actually been reported and documented. Here's what we know. Number one, as part of the CHNV parole program, more than 434,000 Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans have been mass paroled since the program began under Biden and Harris. Second, one of those paroled Venezuelans was Jose Ibarra, who murdered 22-year-old Laken Riley at the University of Georgia. Her cause of death was blunt force trauma and asphyxiation. Third, Renzo Mendoza Montes, a 32-year-old Venezuelan man, was arrested in February for sexually assaulting a 14-year-old girl in Campbell County, Virginia. Fourth, a Venezuelan prison gang, Tren de Aragua, which means train from Aragua, Venezuela, has erupted into a multinational migrant crime syndicate, drugs, human trafficking, prostitution, etc., and is the subject of more than 100 police investigations across the country. New York, Chicago, Florida, Texas, and Colorado, just to name a few. The last of which is where Aurora, Colorado police have arrested at least 10 of those Venezuelan gang members associated with theft and forcibly taking over a hotel. And that's just one city. In New York, they've committed more than 60 robberies, and they were charged with aggravated robbery after dragging a 60-year-old woman down the sidewalk and slamming her into a pole. And fifth, 2 years ago, Breitbart reported the following story. A recent Department of Homeland Security intelligence report received by the Border Patrol instructs agents to look for Venezuelan inmates. The report, reviewed by Breitbart Texas, indicates the Venezuelan government, under the leadership of Nicolas Maduro Moros, is purposefully freeing inmates, including some convicted of murder, rape, and extortion. The report does not state whether the released prison inmates were traveling as a cohesive group, but does state it was commonly shared knowledge among migrants traveling to the United States within a caravan in July 2022 that many of the Venezuelan migrants in the group were convicts and included hardened criminals. The report does not specify that the release of the convicts, understanding they would head to the United States, could be a purposeful geopolitical move specifically intended to impact U.S. national security. The source says the task of identifying Venezuelans who have criminal records in their home country is nearly impossible. One of thousands of Venezuelan migrants surrendering along the U.S.-Mexico border daily, most, according to the source, are being released into the United States. Without effective diplomatic relations with Venezuela, the source says access to criminal databases in that country simply does not exist. All of this perfectly culminates in Springfield, Ohio. Listen, we'll get to the pets thing, but there's much more going on here. Over the last few years, since the creation of the CHNV parole program, somewhere between 15 and 20,000 Haitians were mass paroled to Springfield, Ohio. But look at this infographic from Pew Research. There have been more than 150,000 Haitians granted temporary protective status, mass paroled into the United States. So that means there's 13% of this group taking up residence in Springfield, Ohio. But why Haitians, though? Why are they a part of this mass parole program? Well, because Haiti has been highly unstable for a few years. There's social unrest, there are gangs of violent criminals and literal cannibals running the place. Severe poverty, so they're granted temporary protective status through CHNV, and they're allowed into the country under the guise of asylum. Earlier, though, you heard me say that this is temporary, as in 18 to 24 months. But the Biden-Harris administration keeps extending their stay. So you've heard me say what happens when there's sudden mass migration, legally or illegally. Look at what's happening in Springfield. Take a look at this from Reuters. Benefits rolls swell in Springfield. New arrivals of Haitian origin have pushed up benefit rolls for federally funded programs like Medicaid. So you can see there, prior to April of 2022, there were less than 500 Springfield residents qualified for Medicaid. But by July of this year, there's been a 1,500% increase. What does that mean? It means that there are suddenly a lot of people drawing from our federally funded, taxpayer-funded medical programs without any recompense. Medicaid is just one program. They also need food stamps and cash. That by itself is inflationary. But let's continue. Here's the unemployment charting, also from Reuters. The three different colors represent the unemployment trends in Springfield, Dayton, Ohio, and then nationally. The green line is Springfield, which you can see unemployment has almost doubled since the spring of 2023. This is because migrants need work, and greedy employers can pay them less than the average native worker. This drives wages down and unemployment up. And again, we're only talking about one city in America. We're only talking about 15 to 20,000 people out of millions. So just apply this across the country, multiply the numbers, and consider the national implications. Reuters also reports that from May 2022 to the end of 2023, Springfield rent prices were among the fastest increases in the nation. Take a look. Data from Zillow show rents increasing faster in Springfield, Ohio than the rest of the U.S. as a surge of new immigrants pushed up demand for apartments, though the pace has slowed. So you can see over this 2-year period, rent prices in Springfield are up almost 130%. Why is that? Because suddenly demand for housing goes way up. And then the simple economics of supply and demand inevitably kicks in. Unfortunately, for Americans living in Springfield, they also have to pay the higher prices. The factor that's not reflected in the chart are the vouchers given to these Haitian migrants to afford rent. That is, again, inflationary. Take a look at wages in Springfield. Look at the green line. You can see how the three lines follow similar trends, but pay attention to the green line representing Springfield. Over the course of 5 years, from 2019 to 2024, wages are down. And they're way down from 2 years ago. So just to recap, in Springfield, we have a 1,500% increase in Medicaid enrollment, rising unemployment, rent prices are up, wages are down, and all of it is directly attributable to the CHNV program of mass paroling these 15 to 20,000 Haitian people to Springfield, Ohio. This is what no one is talking about. Donald Trump is not talking about this. Republicans are not talking about this. The mainstream media is, of course, silent about this. Why? Because it pulls the curtain back on a massive problem, a ticking time bomb, and it explains many of the economic issues we face as Americans. The problem is most people would unfortunately find what I'm saying to you as incredibly boring. They don't care. So therein lies the political strategy of both of the major parties. The leftists and the Democrats are deflecting and minimizing the issue, but Republicans are helping them by fixating on a specific problem that they think will get the point across. Something that's juicy enough to generate headlines.
In Springfield, they're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats. They're eating the pets of the people that live there. And this is what's happening in our country, and it's a shame.
I just want to clarify here. You bring up Springfield, Ohio, and ABC News did reach out to the city manager there. He told us there have been no credible reports of specific claims of pets being harmed, injured, or abused by individuals.
That was one of the 4 or 5 fact-check moments in the debate, none of which were for Kamala Harris. David Muir said that ABC reached out to the Springfield city manager, and he told them exactly what they wanted to hear. He told them there were no credible reports of such claims. Trump basically responds saying, well, we're seeing it. We're hearing about it. We're seeing the pictures and the videos and the testimonies like this.
I'm riding on the trail going to my orientation for my job today. And I see a group of Haitian people. There was about 4 of them. They all had geese in their hand. They got away. I couldn't make out the first 3 of the license plate, but I got the numbers. The last numbers was 9898, and it was a gray Toyota Tacoma they took off on. There was about 4 of them. There was 2 men, 2 women.
These Haitians are running into trash cans. They're running into buildings. They're running into... they flipping cars in the middle of the street. They're in the park grabbing up ducks by their neck and cutting their head off and walking off with them and eating them like...
There's been a lot of allegations of animals going missing, ducks being basically
yes, sir.
taken.
There's pictures of that, too.
Can you speak on that? Have you ever seen that in person?
The only thing I've seen, I did see a pig's head laying down in Snyder Park.
You saw a pig's head?
A pig's head.
Like it had been cut off? Or?
Yes, sir.
What did you do? Why'd you kill the cat? Smile for me. Smile with your teeth. Go like this. Did you eat that cat? Did you eat it? No, why'd you kill it? Did you guys see all this?
No, we pulled up and she was just laying there with it.
Did you see her eating it?
Eating it.
She was eating it?
Yeah, she was.
You call the Humane Society, see if they'll come pick this cat up. It's deceased.
I'm angry that foreigners are using up the resources that were set up for the Americans that reside here. I'm angry that another country's flag was being flown in our city. I'm angry when I see our businesses and recreational areas littered with garbage left by people that do not know or understand our laws and culture and are making no attempt to learn about them. And let me be clear, this is not about race. This is about people being given the privilege of coming here from another country and having no respect for our people, our land, or our life's work. People living their life here the way they did in Haiti, angry, stealing, polluting, living in filth, and acting like animals. These are not civilized people. Opening containers in our grocery stores, helping themselves to what's inside and throwing the rest onto the shelves and floors. Pulling off of the highway to publicly clean and gut the roadkill lying there in front of anyone that passes by. Stealing animals from farmers and leaving their severed heads at the side of an old school where children play. Relieving themselves in public. Making some barbaric stew out of the birds that live in our park. This is insanity, and it has to stop.
Folks, those are just the highlights. You want more? I can give you more. And all of those are Springfield residents. I could probably show you an hour of that stuff. And it's not funny. Not in the least. It's actually quite sad in one sense and infuriating in another. You see, the mass parole and the skirting of the legal immigration process bypasses assimilation in one sense. They have no civics education. They have to choose to learn English, but that has to be provided by the community. They can't possibly know how to live as Americans when they've only ever been impoverished Haitians. Somebody has to teach them and integrate them, but that doesn't seem to be the case here. The sad part about the story is when you consider the reason these things are even happening. Why are they eating public animals and domestic pets? Is it because of their heritage with voodoo? Are these deliberate acts of evil? Or is it because they're hungry and they're resorting to desperate measures in order to feed themselves? Okay, let me ask you this. Why are the mainstream media and Democratic elites gaslighting the issue? Because it's a manifestation of the larger issue. Springfield is one place. Springfield is temporarily home to 20,000 migrants from one country. There's millions more from numerous countries across the Fruited Plains. On average, we take in about 1 million immigrants a year, legally. Since Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have been in office, that number has nearly tripled, especially when you consider legal immigration, temporary protective status, asylum, CHNV mass parole, and illegal migration altogether. The truth is that most Americans can feel this problem. We know the problem is there. The problem did not blow up like it has until Biden and Harris took office. You could literally see that on the chart, the encounters chart that I showed you earlier. During the debate, however, Kamala Harris was asked, why did the administration wait until 6 months to act on immigration? And would you have done anything differently? She didn't answer the question. She talked about being a prosecutor in California and claimed to have supported a bill which Republicans didn't support, which would have added 1,500 more CBP agents. In other words, she blamed Donald Trump and the Republicans in Congress for these problems. The problem with that answer is that she, number one, neglects to take any responsibility for creating this problem through their terrible immigration policy. Secondly, they created the systems to expedite the importation of millions of foreign persons outside the legal process. And three, all they needed to do was enforce long-standing law, not draft new legislation, which would not have even scratched the surface of the issue. And President Trump's time in office proves that. You know, politicians have a habit of creating problems and then shifting the blame and then preserving their power by proposing solutions to the very problems they created. What have Biden and Harris done since January of 2021? They terminated the Remain in Mexico policy, that was Trump's policy, which required asylum seekers to wait in Mexico while their immigration cases were being processed. Secondly, they ended the public charge rule, which denied green cards to immigrants who were likely to depend on public programs like food stamps and Medicaid. They lifted travel bans. They reversed Trump's asylum restrictions. They rescinded Trump's executive order to keep undocumented immigrants from being counted in the census. They raised Trump's refugee cap. They terminated construction of the border wall. They have unconstitutionally admitted over 1 million asylum seekers into our country. And you're seeing the civil, cultural, political, and economical effects of it all. They take no accountability for that. But instead, they blame Donald Trump and the congressional Republicans. The strange thing this time, however, is that they propose no solutions. Trump's solution is to use the National Guard and local police forces in addition to CBP to enact mass deportations. I'm sure he would reenact all of the immigration policies of his first term, but he also had a recommendation for Biden and Harris during the debate. Watch.
And I'll tell you what I would do, and I would be very proud to do it. I would say we would both leave this debate right now. I'd like to see her go down to Washington, D.C. during this debate, because we're wasting a lot of time. Go down to Washington, D.C. and let her sign a bill to close up the border, because they have the right to do it. They don't need bills. They have the right to do it. The President of the United States, you'll get him out of bed, you'll wake him up at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, right. You'll say, come on down to the office, let's sign a bill. If he signs a bill that the border is closed, all he has to do is say it to the Border Patrol, who are phenomenal.
The President of the United States has the legal authority to control who may enter the country by Section 212F of the Immigration and Nationality Act. He or she is allowed to restrict entry to any foreign national if it is detrimental to the United States. They both used this act during the pandemic to limit travel. In a national emergency, the President of the United States can legally declare an emergency to deploy resources, including the military, to enforce closures and restrictions at the border. This is how President Trump funded the construction of the southern border wall. So he's right when he describes their authority to put an end to what has been described as an invasion right now. But why do they not? Why don't they? Why not take desperate measures to remove the millions that are unlawfully residing in our country? Why not conclude the mass parole programs, or at least cap admissions, as the Trump administration did? Why not consider the terrible impact this has had on so many Americans in numerous states and cities across the country? Well, Trump has an idea of why this is the case.
We have to have borders, and we have to have good elections. Our elections are bad. And a lot of these illegal immigrants coming in, they're trying to get them to vote. They can't even speak English. They don't even know what country they're in practically. And these people are trying to get them to vote. And that's why they're allowing them to come into our country.
In July, every single Democrat in the House of Representatives opposed the SAVE Act, which would require documentary proof of U.S. citizenship to register to vote in federal elections. Now, why would they do that? In June, I did an episode titled How to Steal the 2024 Election, in which I covered an extensive research project on non-citizen voter registration and participation, which concluded that an estimated 2 million non-citizens will vote in this year's election. This was all based on census data and electoral data and registration data. Why would they do that? In May, I did an extensive segment about Richard Cloward and Francis Fox Piven's Marxist-styled social strategy, which is being theoretically implemented in numerous political arenas in modern American life. It is the strategy of political revolution through societal collapse by orchestrated chaos. It's a flooding of the system with impossible demands, unpayable debt, and unfettered immigration, among other things, to push our society into crisis and economic collapse. Last September, I spent nearly an hour explaining Latino critical theory, hatched from the same liberal academics who created critical race theory, the scholarship which is infamously known today as replacement theory. No, it's not a conservative idea. That's more gaslighting from the media. Its roots trace all the way back to the Frankfurt School and the father of communism himself, Karl Marx. Now, I'm not suggesting that Democrats and leftists are going door to door in Caracas inviting people to the United States. I'm not implying that liberals are passing out golden tickets in Puerto La Cruz. Never let a crisis go to waste. You know who said that? President Obama's Chief of Staff, Rahm Emanuel. If you've realized nothing in the last 27 minutes, what's crystal clear is that if the immigration and the ensuing humanitarian crises are organic, the Democratic Party is capitalizing on its disruptive, revolutionary potential. One of the best ways you can help our show, other than by sharing today's content, is by picking up some We the Free merch at WeTheFreeShow.com. You can be the salt and light you were meant to be by wearing the Salt and Light shirt or by sipping your coffee from the Salt and Light mug, or you can sport the God Bless America shirt and the We the Free crest tee. We've got stickers and a Smells Like Freedom candle, so check out our merch today at WeTheFreeShow.com. Coming in at number 7, the next most important issue to Americans is gun policy. We'll get to President Trump in a moment, but let's start with Kamala Harris's statement in the debate. Watch.
And then this business about taking everyone's guns away. Tim Walz and I are both gun owners. We're not taking anybody's guns away, so stop with the continuous lying about this stuff.
She accuses Donald Trump of lying about her gun policy. Well, this was her position in the previous election.
I support buybacks, and I think that, look, we have 5 million assault weapons on the streets of America, and we have 5 million assault weapons on the streets of America. And assault weapons have been designed to kill a lot of human beings quickly. They are weapons of war. And it's something I'm so passionate about and so looking forward to being president to address. We've got to deal with this.
How mandatory is your gun buyback program?
It's mandatory.
Moderates and conservatives, you know very well that this is the constant refrain of the left in the wake of every single mass shooting. They criticize the originalists' adherence to the founders' intent in the Second Amendment. They label every gun as an ambiguous assault weapon, just as literally any physical object could be designated at the scene of a crime. They never let a crisis go to waste in the immediate reaction to a mass shooting or a school shooting to champion the subtraction of firearms from American society. This is what Harris articulated in 2019, all the way through the Appalachia school shooting the week of the debate. Here she was the day before the debate.
And we who believe in the freedom to live safe from gun violence will finally pass an assault weapons ban, universal background checks, and red flag laws.
So this is the sort of policy flip-flopping we've seen since Kamala Harris was undemocratically selected by Democrat elites to be the Democrat candidate. Again, though, the beautifully unique perspective we have in this election is that we've already seen both of the candidates in office. We have the record. We know what they've done. The last time she was running for president, her position was clear. Create a federal program to forcibly buy back American personal firearms. Now, here's the Biden-Harris record. They created ghost guns regulation. Ghost guns are firearm kits without any kind of identification or serial numbers. They enacted rules to require background checks for ghost guns and mandated that manufacturers included serial numbers on all the parts. They have called for an assault weapons ban their entire time in office, but nothing has happened. They enacted regulations on stabilizing braces. They treated them like they're short-barreled rifles. And this administration created several executive orders to increase funding for community programs to attack gun trafficking. What about President Trump? Well, he wasn't asked anything about the Second Amendment or gun control or gun violence during the debate, but we do have his record between 2017 and 2020. First of all, on numerous occasions, Trump voiced his support for expanding background checks, but nothing ever happened. Secondly, in 2018, in light of the Las Vegas shooting, Trump's DOJ banned bump stocks, which was just overturned this year. These are devices that enable semi-automatic rifles to fire in a similar fashion to fully automatic rifles, which are illegal in the United States. And then third, in 2019, after mass shootings in Ohio and Texas, Trump voiced support for red flag laws, but nothing ever happened. The real difference is in the rhetoric and the numbers. When President Trump was in office, there was no drumbeat rhetoric from the Oval Office or the Brady press room to eradicate firearms from the United States. And from 2017 to 2020, there was an average of 16,464 gun deaths, not counting suicides. Since Kamala Harris and Joe Biden have been in office, the rhetoric has been the subtraction of assault weapons, and yet gun deaths have risen more than 22%. The genuinely conservative position is to protect the Second Amendment tooth and nail, because the founders' and framers' intent was the people's right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed as the last line of defense against a tyrannical regime, if one should ever arise. True conservatives realize that guns are not the problem. The problem is who's holding the gun. The problem wouldn't be solved by any gun laws, because the problem holding the weapon would resort to something else to create his desired chaos. A perfect example is the shooting at Appalachia High School. No laws or regulations other than outright gun confiscation would have prevented that. Red flag laws would not have prevented it. Background checks would not have stopped it. Conservatives are constitutional originalists who believe that gun violence must be endured to stave off something much worse, a totalitarian regime. Trump is significantly closer to that conservative idea than Harris, who is closer to the originalists' worst nightmare. Oh yeah, and who is it that's been nearly assassinated twice now? Now, to close out our discussion, the 8th most important election issue to Americans, according to Pew Research, is abortion. The research shows a fairly wide gap on this issue. Only 35% of Trump supporters see abortion as a top issue, while 67% of Harris supporters see it as one. Moderates, I'm sure, fall somewhere in the middle there. It's really important to talk about why those numbers exist. Why is it that a minority of Trump supporters see abortion as a top issue? Why do a majority of Harris supporters see it as a top concern this election? Well, let's speak to the latter first.
And I pledge to you, when Congress passes a bill to put back in place the protections of Roe v. Wade, as President of the United States, I will proudly sign it into law. But understand, if Donald Trump were to be reelected, he will sign a national abortion ban. Understand, in his Project 2025, there would be a national abortion, a monitor that would be monitoring your pregnancies, your miscarriages.
Kamala Harris makes 4 significant claims there. First, she says that Congress will pass a bill to codify abortion. Second, she says as president, she would sign the bill into law, making abortion completely legal in the United States. Third, she says if reelected, Donald Trump would ban abortion nationwide. And fourth, that he would nominate as some sort of reproductive czar a national monitoring system on pregnancy. In the year before the Dobbs decision and the subsequent overturning of Roe v. Wade, there were over 622,000 abortions. Since then, abortion numbers have dramatically increased. Last year, there were over 1 million abortions. We averaged over 86,000 abortions a month in 2023. And this despite 14 states having near total abortion bans. Now, why do I say near total? Because every one of those 14 states have exceptions. For example, I live in Tennessee. They have banned all abortions at any point except when there's a threat to the life or physical health of the mother. Listen to me very closely. There is not a single state in the country that has completely banned abortion. Not one. 41 states have exceptions and rules. 9 states and the District of Columbia are the only places with 0 restrictions. So again, I ask, how is it that abortions have only gone up since Roe was overturned? Is that attributable to Joe Biden and Kamala Harris? Sure, they have articulated their support for reproductive health care and abortion rights, but have they actually done anything? It's been 2 years since the Dobbs ruling. They've done nothing legislatively to codify abortion. Why not? I bet they could get enough Republicans to support an amendment to the Constitution for that. Why don't they do that? In 2020, they ran on preserving Roe v. Wade, but that didn't work. Look, Trump did 3 things. He appointed judges and justices, the Supreme Court and federal courts. He revoked federal funding for international abortions and for organizations like Planned Parenthood, and he helped protect organizations who religiously or morally object to providing abortions. Those 3 things. What have Biden and Harris done? They allowed Roe v. Wade to ruin. They restored federal funding for international abortions and Planned Parenthood. Their DOJ has come after some pro-life protesters, and that's about it. So again, I come back to the question, why have abortions dramatically increased since Roe was overturned? The goal of the ruling was to remove the issue from federal case law. The 2 conservative justices of the Supreme Court, Thomas and Alito, and the 4 moderates of the court, Roberts, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Barrett, all viewed Roe v. Wade as an improper ruling, that the justification for the ruling was fabricated and unconstitutional. That's why it was tossed. If you want to get into why Roe was so easily dismantled, go watch or listen to episode 47. The point that I'm trying to make is that abortions are much more frequent since Donald Trump moved the issue to the states. According to the CDC, in 2016, President Obama's final year in office, there were 623,000 abortions. In 2019, when President Trump was in office, there were 629,000 abortions. Even in 2020, with a global pandemic, abortion numbers were in the average range of 620,000. Under Biden and Harris, in 2021, there were 622,000 abortions. Roe is overturned in 2022. Abortion becomes a state-by-state issue, and in 2023, there were over 1 million abortions in the U.S. So, why do 67% of Harris supporters think abortion is a top issue this election? Because they're gaslighting the American people in saying that Trump would ban abortion, and secondly, that they would legalize it at the national level. They can't. They don't have the numbers in Congress. But more importantly, the reason for which Roe was overturned is the same reason for which abortion could never become federal law.
And as far as the abortion ban, no, I'm not in favor of abortion ban, but it doesn't matter because this issue has now been taken over by the states.
Would you veto a national abortion ban if it came
Well,
to
I
your
won't
desk?
have to because, again, two things. Number one, she said she'll go back to Congress. She'll never get the vote. It's impossible for her to get the vote. We don't have to discuss it because she'd never be able to get it, just like she couldn't get student loans. They couldn't get student loans. They didn't even come close to getting student loans. They taunted young people and a lot of other people that had loans. They can never get this approved. So it doesn't matter what she says about going to Congress. Well, wonderful. Let's go to Congress. Do it. But the fact is that for years they wanted to get it out of Congress and out of the federal government. And we did something that everybody said couldn't be done. And now you have a vote of the people on abortion.
This is really important. Don't miss this. The Supreme Court is the foremost part of the judicial branch of the United States government. They are not the legislative branch. That would be Congress, the House and the Senate. Roe v. Wade was Supreme Court case law, which gave weak, semi-legal footing to abortion on the national level for half a century. The people of the United States had zero input. They had zero say on the matter, which is counter to the American founding. In that case, which should have been overturned a long time ago, seven justices decided the issue of abortion for all of the American people. Now, because it was overturned, all 350 million of us get to decide. That is democracy. Set aside the rhetoric and the conversations about viability and conversations about conception and trimesters, full-term and post-birth abortions and whose body is actually being affected here. The issue of abortion is no longer a federal issue. It's not. Donald Trump can't do anything about it. Kamala Harris can't do anything about it because it's no longer a federal issue. I think most of Trump's supporters realize this, which is why only 35% of his supporters recognize abortion as a top issue. It's no longer a national conversation. It's a state-by-state conversation. Truthfully, though, President Trump holds the moderate position on this issue. Personally, I wish that were not the case because Christians believe that life begins at the moment of conception. That's why we oppose all abortion. It's why we oppose IVF, because it destroys more than 80% of the embryos produced. All that to say, despite what Harris claims, abortion is not on the ballot this November. Well, there you have it. Those are the top 8 issues for the 2024 election. Hopefully now you fully understand the policies of both candidates so that you can make an informed decision at the ballot box. Now, for those of you who are freebies, each of these 8 subjects will be produced as special videos. I'm going to release them in order every 3 days starting tomorrow. You must share those videos with people that you know you don't agree with. Ask them to watch and give you some feedback. Ask them to tell you what they think. We've got to consolidate conservative support, persuade moderates, define Harris walls, and illustrate the contrast between the two in order to be victorious. I'll be gone next week, but look out for these special releases every 3 days starting tomorrow, and I'll be back on October 3rd with a new episode. But that's going to do it for me. What'll it be next time? We'll see. For now, go and be the salt and light you were meant to be, and we'll see you next time on We the Free. Thanks for watching today. Listen, I want to make sure that you stay informed on the news and the biblical response to it, so do yourself and us a favor and hit the subscribe button before you go. And then we would love for you to check out WeTheFreeShow.com to grab yourself some merch to spread the word about We the Free. And we're also going to put a video on the screen right now that we think you'll like. Now, go and be that salt and light, and we'll see you next time.